Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I don't know about where you are in the world today, but it's raining and miserable here in North Yorkshire. So if anybody's got any sunshine, stick it in the chat, and so we know where to go, or at least show us a picture of what it looks like with some sunshine. We've forgotten what it looks like now. Welcome to this afternoon session. I'm Jo Stanford. I head up the Healthcare Project and Change Association. We are a not-for-profit community interest company working collaboratively with the other professions across the NHS, UK-wide. So we've got some fantastic regional networks. If you're not signed up to join one of those, please do. We've got some great communities connecting and sharing. We also support and advocate on behalf of the profession and look to build the professional capability across the health and care sector. The other events coming up, if you haven't signed up for this was a new one we added in after the first event, Raining in Salford. But that's not unexpected though, is it, Mark? On the 10th of December, so there's this time, so next week on Tuesday, we have the next in this series of 3 sessions, which are in the Change Under Pressure kind of program support for anybody who is impacted by change. We know that that's going on across the entire sector at the moment at every level. And that one we're going to be focusing on career resilience, particularly around project and change management, but it's open to anybody to join because it's a bit of a daunting world if you're looking at having to maybe apply for jobs, whether it's your own job internally because of a reorganization or whether you're looking outside because your job is at risk. It's some ideas in terms of thoughts and ideas for what to look for currently and in this sort of market and digital world that we're in now. So if you're interested, do sign up for that one. We have our next joint event with FedIP, so Federation for Informatics Professionals, and done jointly with Projecting Success, which deliver our level 4 digital project manager apprenticeship program, who are a great group of people, and looking at how AI can support project data transformation. And data analytics is something that I think everybody needs to at least know the fundamentals of, and how AI can help us with that is probably a very useful insight. So do sign up for that one as well. Those are the next ones we have in plan. And then we've also got some regional networks coming up. There's the Wales one. If you are in Wales or want to meet your Wales counterparts, do sign up for that one on the 3rd, and also in the east of England on the same day, but not at the same time. And then we've got one in January for London, so they're getting ahead of the game, getting their dates out for next year already. Do go on the website and sign up to join up to those regional community events. It's a great way to find out what's going on and to share and learn. We're coming to this stage of the year where people are thinking about, last quarter of the year, what do they need to do in terms of their professional development and their appraisal for the end of this year. If you've got any gaps and if you can think of anything you want to do to build your skills, whether you're staying in your job and carrying on forward and want to upskill, whether you're looking for new opportunities and developing skills to change roles, now is a good time to think about it and get it planned in so that you've got that evidence and you've got that training ready for when those opportunities come up. So change under pressure. This was in response to all of the impact of changes that are going on. We've had one event so far, and it's supported by some additional resources. So some free resources that everybody can access. There's some low-cost ones that people can tap into to support themselves, but also their organisations and support their teams with development as well. And then some premium offers for organisations that want some bespoke advice and support and help to get to that future-ready state, because getting the change in place is one thing, but being ready and competent and capable for the future, that's the bigger challenge. So do have a think about that, and if there's anything that could help you, your team or your organisation. And we've got some bite-sized courses coming soon, so do keep an eye out for those. We'll let you know when they're out. We've also got some really good bespoke training, and particularly because change is not just eternal now, but also very prominent right now, there are some courses that could support you or your team or your organisation with being able to lead and deliver that change more effectively, including which is we've got Brin's storytelling masterclasses and workshops, and you can find out more about those on our website, but also you can ask him the questions today because he's here. And he's very grateful for giving his time to help people to think about your individual stories and what that means to you. So for those of you that have joined, it's fantastic to have you with us. Without further ado, I will hand over to Brin to talk about storytelling and how you can confidently tell your story. Thank you, Brin.
Thanks so much for the lovely intro, Joe, and great to see so many people here today. Really, where this came from was thinking about, for so many of us at a certain time in our career or a time in our organizational change, we end up feeling stuck. Your motivation feels low, you feel trapped, you don't know where to go next. And today, what I want to show you is how you can use stories to overcome that. So this is an interactive session, so have a pen and paper nearby. We will also be doing Menti exercises. But to start, this is an opportunity for everyone to reflect, to take a little bit of time out of the often craziness of your working day, particularly on a Monday, and just spend a little bit of time investing in yourself. So should we start with a check-in? How are you feeling today? The Menti poll has just dropped in, and as we get the results coming in, we'll get an idea of how people are feeling. Let's take a moment to check in. I like how that came in immediately, cold. Yes, it's definitely a day for tea. We've got some tired, festive, good for a Monday, which is great to see. Yeah, lovely. Joe's already a little bit of Joe's magic sparkle you picked up, especially from Joe's energy. Lost, weary, unmotivated. So we're getting a mixed bag. I think Teo just popped in the chat. Also, please do use the chat for comments. The more we can interact, the better it's going to be. Feel free to leave your cameras off or on, by the way. It's nice to see some faces, but equally, I know if people are feeling a little bit lost, frustrated, knackered, you might not want to be on camera. So discombobulated, good use of the word. So I don't want to say I'm pleased to see people not coming here 100% sorted, but today is going to give us a chance to work through when you are feeling a bit lost, a little bit discombobulated, and you need to think about how can I use my story to overcome that. Today is going to be the day for you. So I'm going to very briefly share my screen. It's not going to be loads of slides today, you'll be pleased to know. But I suppose a good place to start is to start with why stories? So a little bit of a trigger warning. We will touch on some themes of harm and violence in the webinar today. It's not gratuitous, but I do understand if some people might find them a bit shocking. So I do like to warn people in advance. And the reason the stories, some of the elements I'm going to share are harmful or shocking is partly because for me, the journey into storytelling started over the body of a dead schoolgirl. So she had been murdered, and I was part of the investigation team. I was working alongside the South African police as part of an academic investigation team looking at profiling offenders. And standing over the body of that schoolgirl, I had the most amazing rush of exhilaration and outrage and purpose, thinking, you know what, this is something that I can stop happening again. And this is something that's really worth me throwing my energy and time into. So then when the opportunity came for me to go interview serial murderers, this now I can start to understand why people are doing, why these men do the things they do, and how we can in future prevent them. So I spent the next 6 months to a year driving from maximum security prison to maximum security prison, speaking with serial murderers. And one of the most common things I found was the role that their stories played in either creating or maintaining their offending. So the stories they told themselves about themselves ended up being what drove their crimes. And having seen how stories can go wrong, I really want to stop the same thing happening to you. So this session is designed to help you prepare for transitions, deal with the struggles, but most importantly of all, avoid some of the traps that serial murderers and all of us in our everyday lives might fall into around the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's going to be 3 parts today. There's going to be a little bit more about the stories you need to avoid, and then we're going to move on to, right, how do we solve those bad stories? And then finally, we're going to take responsibility for crafting our own story. And that's when we're going to do interaction, because you're going to get the chance to start building your better story about yourself live. I suppose the best place to start with describing where stories might go wrong is with the story of one of the men I spoke to, and let's call him Sasanda. All of the men I spoke to got given pseudonyms when I speak about them now. So let's call him Sasanda. And Sasanda was he's very polite, very neat, very soft-spoken, spoke excellent English. And when we were, he'd answer my questions truthfully, and he had a wonderful sort of quite a self-deprecating sense of humor. But one of the things, what I noticed, because when you're interviewing, you are feeding off what you're watching someone else's body language, seeing what chimes with them, seeing what works for them and what doesn't. And one of the things that Sasanda used to do, when I asked him a question that was very emotionally triggering, he would sort of pause, sit back in his chair, and kind of look at me from under, like, the bottom of his eyes, and then answer. And this sort of emotional pause for me became a signal of when something was really triggering him. And nothing triggered Sasanda more than any talk about rejection. He said, like, this was one of the things he always hated. He said, when other kids teased me at school or they wouldn't play with me, that would make me so angry I would shake. And the only way I could get rid of this anger was if I laid my hands on them. And so a lot of Sasanda's story of his childhood is the story of him getting into fights. And despite that, he did quite well at school. He graduated high school, which in the time and the place he grew up in was quite unusual. And he prided himself at being quite intellectual. But this response to rejection started to become the dominant theme in his life, especially when he started to have girlfriends. Now, Sasanda was quite a charmer and he had a lot of girlfriends, but the thing that always came to the fore was his violent response to being rejected. And this, as he grew, became worse and worse. He established his own business and was successful. He became one of the main suppliers to the provincial government, putting wiring into houses as an electrician. He started training to be a pastor. He got married. However, throughout all of this, he kept up a number of different relationships, and violence became part of those, because in his words, I needed to dominate in order to show that I was the man. And if someone rejects me, you are going to get hurt. So this narrative became the way in which Sasanda connected together a lot of the dots of his life. And we'll return to this graph in a moment. but all the events of his life became woven together by this sense of rejection, this desire for revenge. And that single narrative led to him committing the crimes which he ended up being imprisoned for. He ended up committing 4 murders and spending the rest of his life in prison, and overcome by regret, thinking, how did I cannot believe I did the things I did, because I believed that it was justified. And that's going to be the first challenge, is how do we overcome a single dominant narrative that starts to define who we are? Now, I've seen the same single narrative focus when I'm talking to people about their careers, where you only define yourself as one thing, or only able to do one thing, or continually trapped in a single problem. And we're going to think about how we overcome that. Because so often being trapped in a single narrative, you can lead to something like a condemnation script. So I noticed across all the serial murderers I spoke to that a condemnation script was a common structure. Their life would be going okay, like Susanda's was. I get married, I become successful, and then suddenly I have a downfall. And they very often express that as, I am the victim of an uncaring world. The world put this on me, and I just had no choice but to react the way I did. And drawing parallels with where a lot of us find ourselves currently, it feels very much like you could end up being the victim of an unfriendly world and feel very helpless with all the things that are going around organizationally or politically. And again, the danger with that sense of helplessness is it becomes a victim narrative, becomes disempowering, and it doesn't give you a way forward. So how do we find a way? How do we do this better? Now, you get to see me click between screens because this is going to be the first interactive section. So the temptation when we're faced with a narrative that's not working, the temptation is to say, well, just give us the facts. If I know the facts, or then I will know what to do. The facts will tell me a better way forward. But this is one of the problems with facts. And I'm going to show you a screen, and I'm going to ask you to put in the chat while you're watching this video, tell me what you see. And tell me what you think is happening. It's, oh, sorry, just stopping my the YouTube. You know what? It's so fascinating watching the comments that people are putting in the chat. And I should have said there's no right and no wrong answer. The reason is that that little video is pretty famous. That's a clip from 1944. It was a video shown in an experiment done by two psychologists who had fled Nazi Germany, and they were doing this experiment with American university students, and they showed them this clip. And what's fascinating is they showed 111. Oh, thank you, Lynn. Lynn gives a very thorough response. They showed 111 students this video, and all but 3 of those students noticed things that you are putting in the chat. Actually, what that shows is those are the shapes are completely random. They're not showing anything. They are just shapes designed to move randomly around a screen in a random way. And only 3 of the initial respondents identified those shapes as just doing random stuff. You know, there's a little triangle, there's a big triangle running around or moving around anti-clockwise around a box. So, and David in the chat beat me to the punch on this one. Actually, what they noticed is that 98% of people, and subsequently this research has been repeated hundreds of times, 98% of people do what we've all done in the chat. We project meaning onto that randomness. The shapes become figures breaking free, retreating, breaking out. There's themes of bullying. I know someone who I showed this video to, they saw people going on a date, going on a date and then having someone chase them and having to hide in their house. So the reason I showed you this video is to show that the facts on themselves don't mean anything. What makes the difference is the story we tell ourselves about those facts. And if we don't tell a story about those facts, people are going to just make up their own story anyway. So given that there were so many different people saw different, interpreted a random set of shapes differently, that also means that when you're looking at the facts of your life, the randomness, we can then shape those in a different way. And a way we can do this is actually using the tools of narrative therapy. So narrative therapy was something that actually started with prisoners in Australia. And then, sorry, I'm just getting my slides back up. And what they realized is that a lot of people felt very trapped in the stories they were sharing. Like the Heidel and Simmel video clip I just showed, people feeling trapped in, everything felt like it was a situation of abuse. Whatever they saw was that problem. For example, you're trapped in an abusive relationship, or in the case of prisoners, you were trapped in your identity. It was like, I was only ever a prisoner. I'm only ever a bad person. And sorry, I'm just going to go back one slide. What they started to do is to say, of all the facts that the person was telling themselves about themselves, what facts are not related to that problem? So if you think of Susanda's story, if the dominant narrative in red is all about rejection, what if we picked another non-problem related moment? So, for example, for Susanda, what if we picked the fact that he was a successful businessman? What if in his story, he started to emphasize that more than the story he was telling himself about rejection? And he started to link up all the events of his life behind a narrative of his success as a businessman. And what if he did that for all the other things? He could have done that for being a married man. He could have done that for being a trainee pastor. Might sound weird, but he could even have done that for being a bit of a Casanova, to say, you know what, actually, I'm accepted far more than I'm rejected. And so what you build up is you build up a wider repertoire of stories that you can tell yourself about yourself. And that gives you much more flexibility in how you might wish to face um, life events and life problems. And what narrative psychologists call this is the difference between a thin story and a thick story. So in a thin story, there's not much detail. It's not context specific. It's very broad, very vague. Like for Susanda's, if I get rejected, I need to be violent. It's saturated in problems, and sometimes it represents the other person's view of you. So, giving a work example, I know I've spent a large portion of my career being a line manager or a manager, and in exactly the type of roles that have been labeled by other people as unnecessary or wasteful or duplicative middle management. That's other people's stories. That's the thin story. Low detail, no context, saturated in the problem. What we want to try do is when we identify alternative stories to go for something that's highly detailed. It's specific. It gives you more options and it is a better representation of your preferred self. As Jocelyn has just put in the chat, this is about the preferred self that you want to bring into that environment. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen again because I think there's what we want to do. There's a hack for identifying those stories. And the hack is to start finding stories that encourage agency. I'd mentioned victim narratives. Feature of a lot of the victim narratives are the sense of passivity, of being trapped. What I want to start doing now with you in the half hour we have is start building out a more agentic story, a story that's based around a moment in time when you have shown agency, you've taken control of your problem. As Ashley's just put in the chat, instead of focusing on your problem, focusing on a time when you've taken agency and overcome a problem. So there we go. And Helen has put it in the chat, so you can also click on what's in the chat. But here are some prompts, and I want you, as I'm talking, and one of these prompts is probably going to call out to you more than others. So think about, what is your ideal future? Or you can think back about, what is the toughest thing I've ever overcome? You can think about, this is me at my best, or this is an ideal bigger than me. This is something that inspires me, or I'll work towards the idea bigger than myself. And finally, the people who helped me. So have a look at those. And sorry to miss some people for 12:30. You're going to miss the really cool bit, so you'll have to watch it back. But I will have a look at those prompts. And if you're sitting with a pen and paper, write them down, because in a moment, we're going to go to Menti. But first, having shared Susanda's story, I think I should share mine and show you and give you. Yeah, we can go back a slide, Ashley, and give an example of an agentic story. So this story happened it's probably about 7 years ago. So one afternoon, I walked into my kitchen at home and I decided to kill myself. I just felt completely overwhelmed with feelings of failure. I felt like I had failed in life. I felt like I'd failed my family. I hadn't protected them. Um, I certainly didn't feel like I was any good at my job. I felt I'd screwed that up too. And I just wanted it to stop. And when that thought popped into my head, I was such a feeling of relief that the pain would go away. And I knew where I was going to do it. I knew how I was going to do it. And luckily, that feeling of relief was followed a moment later with a feeling of anger, because I'd spent 15 years in police. I knew that death wasn't pretty. And I knew my family was going to be the people that found me, or my boy was going to be the person that found me. And so I picked up the phone, called virtually the first counsellor I could find, and I spoke with someone. And so I started my journey of started my journey of trying to come to terms with how I was feeling. And I realized in that journey that I had fallen into the same traps Sasanda had. I had started to believe a narrative that I'd whispered in my own ear, that I just wasn't good enough. And weirdly, the next building block dropped into place when a few months later, I was sitting waiting for the lunar eclipse with my son, who was about 8 at the time. And while we're waiting for the moon to be swallowed up, I said, "Do you want me to tell you a story?" He said, "Yeah, all right." So I made up a story on the spot. It was one of the African stories. It was a similar style to the African stories my mum had played on the cassette player in the car. And it was called The Rabbit and the Night Snake. And I told him that story, and I expected he'd be bored and he'd just go, "Yeah, whatever, Dad." But he was like, "Oh, that was really good. Can you tell me another one?" So I was like, "Okay." So I made up another one, and then he said, "Oh, can you do another one, please?" And I said, "Okay, one more, and then you have to go to bed." Um, and I told him one more story, and then as we got up to go to bed, he hugged me around my middle and said, "Dad, I love your stories. Um, I really, really love them." And I thought to myself, you know what? That is something I need to do more of. And that is part of the reason why I started to do the storytelling training and why I'm here today. Because by re-narrating my own story and by trying to share what I went through in the hope it helps other people, I'm moving further and further away from that dark place. And I'm telling a different story about myself. One that instead of being the victim, you become more powerful. So that is my story, and I'm telling you partly as an example, but also because now we're going to unpack it, and we're going to unpack it while you build your own story. And I'm going to unpack it using a simple story structure that you'll be given in the chat. I've stolen the story structure from a much smarter chap than myself, David Hutchins. And what you do is you break your story down using this prompt. You give a time and place. So there I was, a conflict. What did somebody want? Or what was the challenge they're faced with? Cause and effect. That happened, and so that happened, and so that happened, and so that happened, until finally something else. So in the chat, Helen's put your story prompts. And what we're going to do now is we're going to build our stories live. So either you can do it on a piece of paper next to you, or you can do it on the Menti that's going to land in the chat. If you're doing it on the Menti, we're going to show the Menti screen. So for some of you who would have come to the previous session we had with Jesse Cunnett, though building stories live helped you see what helps you see what other people were thinking, and it's a way of sharing. And I know for those who there, they found it like a lovely, warm event. However, I know because people might be wanting to tell their very private stories, similar to what, David has put in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing, incidentally, David. That is also really powerful. Put it in the chat or keep it to yourself. I'm going to go through each prompt and give people a chance to unpack. So firstly, the situation. That's where we're going to start. When did this happen and where were you? So if you recall how I started my story, I started by saying the situation. So there I was in the kitchen. It was an afternoon. I could have done a little bit more detail, because what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to situate it in a time and a place. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to do that. If you want to put it in the Menti poll, do. There we go. Thank you so much for sharing. Somebody's sharing about being belittled by a senior manager. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing in advance. I know it can be hard, but it's always appreciated. Lovely. I can see the situation's building, and I don't know how people are feeling who are watching this, but I'm already feeling, as soon as you've given me the situation, I want to know what's going to happen next. And what is starting to happen here is something called narrative transportation. So it's when you get transported and immersed in a story. And there's lots of research to suggest that when that happens, that story is also more likely to be convinced and persuaded by it. And the persuasive effect of narrative transportation, of being swept up in a story, has actually been shown to strengthen over time. So if you're transported into someone's story, for example, and I'm just looking at what's on the screen, whether you're fear about your dad's death or being belittled by a senior manager, already I'm finding myself drawn in. And that story, if you tell it, is some story that'll go stronger and stronger and stronger over time. If we can go on to the next Menti prompt, the next one is, what was the problem? Some of you have already started to establish the problem. What did you want? What was the challenge you were faced with? I saw somebody mentioning in the previous slide, for example, of being surprised by 360 feedback or being belittled by a manager. So what did you want to do, or what were you trapped in? Using the example of my story, unpacking it, the problem I was faced with was those suicidal feelings. And incidentally, I realized that now, having shared my story and shared it more, is that those feelings aren't that unusual. They're not that rare. But there we go. What was the problem? And I see someone. Thank you for sharing about your son. So there, you're faced with a problem. You're faced with a challenge, and already as a listener, I'm wanting to know, how are you going to overcome it? What was stopping you? So for me, it was the problem I was faced with was that sense of the suicidal thought, but also I was faced quite rapidly afterwards with being faced with the problem that I'd fallen victim to my own story. And I had fallen victim to that little red line story about me not being good enough. So the challenge then for me was, right, after you've got the problem, what happens next. And in my story, it's the steps I take next to start to address the problem. But I'm going to keep quiet for a second and let people write. I can see Maria. I think the Menti slide has changed for me. It's onto problem. What did someone want? And what is stopping
It's
them?
okay. I had to come out and come back in. It's my
Oh,
computer.
wonderful.
Thanks.
Oh,
I'm back in again.
Wonderful. I'm glad it's fixed. And thank you so much for sharing. It's very moving seeing the stories that are coming into the chat. Yeah, no, you can see people talking about, having starting to doubt your ability as a manager, having problems come up at work that hadn't been discussed with you, having a phone call that your mum was dying, and what I'm liking so much from the stories I'm seeing is that you are drawing on challenges not just in your professional life but also in your personal life. So for me, the story I told about very much my personal life became a story that then was something that has motivated me in my professional life and become a focus for me about what type of opportunities are best for me. And Alexander Crawford, you are absolutely right. That has been entirely my experience. And just before we pop onto the next slide, I'd say I avoided telling the story, the night snake story, for not for years, but for longer than I should have, because I thought people would judge me a bit for it, going like, "Oh man, other people have much bigger problems than you. Come on, chap, pull your socks up. You're making a big thing about nothing at all." And I found it entirely. That's entirely not accurate, is the fact that people have always been wonderfully accepting, and actually sharing my own story, I hope, allows other people to share theirs. And it's exactly the feeling that I can see in the room now, and everyone wanting to give each other a hug. So let's move to the next one. So what action did you take? What did you do? And I think some of you have already touched on this. But what we're wanting to establish is that cause and effect of the story. So in my story, what action did I take? I spoke with someone. I spoke with a counselor. But then what that caused for me was a realization that I was trapped in a narrative. And then what happened next was the conversation I had with my son. And that you can bed a story in a story, because I told you too, one of that feeling sitting in the kitchen, but secondly, of having that conversation with my son, which made me realize that a way to start to kill my killer story is a better story, and building that. So it would be lovely to see for people what action did you take. Lovely. So counseling, CBT. Something I've learned on my journey is just asking for help is an amazingly powerful thing and amazingly difficult to do. There we go, action. And I'm following the story of the person in the middle who's been talking about how do you address the managerial problems. And again, you've responded with facts, demonstrating what is important to you, and how you dealt with the issue. Yeah, the Nancy Klein, what am I assuming? It's also very powerful. It's like, what is the story? What is the story I'm telling myself about this situation? Or what, or what is the story I'm telling myself about me in the situation? And thinking about how could we change it? And thank you so much for sharing. I'm seeing a lot of the stories in you, and some, very personal. And thank you. It's so much appreciated that you're joining in. And now we'll come to the last slide of what changed. So at the end of the story, what changed as a result of that experience? Now, in my story, what changed is I got stuck more into stories. But also sometimes, and I know sometimes when people tell a story about their lives, they sort of feel like it's not as resolved as I'd like it to be. So, for example, if you're telling your story about a career, you'd love the story of your narrative to end with the story of, let's say, a traumatic episode leading a project where you overcame loads of problems, and you would want to be able to say at that end of the story, and it was successful, and everyone was happy. But sometimes that's not how life is. So that's where you can just go into what did you learn? To say the project was really hard. I overcame lots of challenges, and ultimately it wasn't really a success. But what did you learn? What will you take from the story into the future? So for me, the thing I learned from Night Snake, the Night Snake story was I learned to pay attention to my own stories. And God, and be very conscious about the story I'm telling myself about myself. Wonderful. I see someone's posted a wonderful example already in Menti about you learned new techniques for helping yourself. Um, so be acknowledging that if facts don't help you, you do have the toolkits, the techniques to help you in the future. And I love Joe's example too. Wonderful. And so, and what you want to do with the end of the story is to tell people exactly, leave people knowing. And sometimes that person is just yourself. Leave yourself knowing, what am I taking from the story into the future? Because you can label the story how you want. And what I'd like you to do as you're wrapping up your stories, and I know either you've put it in the Menti or you've written down on the page next to, or you might just be sitting there thinking about what your story might be. Part of the power of what you've done is you've written it down. And there's a wonderful story from an example from someone called Studs Terkel. He's a famous sort of oral historian, and he's interviewed literally thousands of people about everything from World War II to their experience of death. And one of the things he's noticed is people don't always know what they don't always know what they think until they say it. And he gives the example of speaking to a young mum in a housing tenement in America. He was American from Chicago, and she said she told him her story, I think this was about working life and poverty. And she said, "Can you play that back to me?" And he played her story back to her. And then she said, "Can you do it again? I didn't know I thought that." And that's something that's so powerful about just writing down your story, because sometimes it helps you know what you think, but also when it's pen and ink on a page, my personal experience was it feels more under control. It's something you have under your narrative can echo very loudly in your skull, but when it's down on the page, it is something you can control and you can manipulate. And if that's the only thing people come away from today with, it would be that hint. That you get it down on paper and say it. Now, if you have found your story very powerful and it is something you think, actually, I'm going to use this, give your story a name. So I called the story I told you, I always called that Night Snake. It's again, by labeling it, I am then in more control of it. The story is something that I've created. I've got it out there. I've named it. So by externalizing my story, it's under my command. And I'm loving some of the result, what people are writing now in the Menti about what's changed and what did you learn. So before I wrap up and give people time to ask any questions they might have, one of the questions that I've often been asked when I'm doing these workshops is, okay, what next? What do I do with the story I've created? How do I bring it into my daily life? And there's a plethora of ways, and we can pick some of them up in a follow-up workshop. But one of the most important things for me is to practice it. Now, that you can practice it by speaking to people. We've got now with the HPCA, we've got a storytelling circle, or we've got a storytelling community rather. And what we've done before is set up story sharing opportunities so people get to practice their narrative. That's really particularly helpful, for example, if a story you're telling about your work is something you want to use, for example, in interviews. But also, practicing telling your story can simply be something that you do for yourself in the privacy of your own room. Journaling, I know, is often an important part of reflective practice for clinical staff, but also whatever your role, you can start to do journaling. There is a lot of research that just the act of spending 15 minutes 3 times a week writing down what you're feeling has a positive effect on feelings of overwhelm. And then finally, you could share your story. So I know I've seen it a lot more on social media, but even within the workplace, people speaking with their teams who are faced with a challenge, managers or leaders, writing to the teams in a week note and telling a short vignette of something in their career or something that they've gone through that would help their team either understand them, build a relationship with the team, or motivate the team about the future. So those are the 3 things to talk about in how one might embed. And of course, in addition to the feedback forms, I would love it if people would give feedback on what was good, what we could do better on. And if you want to hear more, you can sign up for the storytelling community, either on the link or drop the email on the QR code, and we will follow up. And yes, 1 hour does feel very short, so I would be delighted to organize follow-ups. Tell me what you'd like to be followed up on, because I am a massive story geek. I could take this in about a dozen different ways. So what are the bits you'd like to hear more about? We could go into the science of stories. We could go into the application of stories. We could go into building our own stories as a community. So bring it on. And yeah, and then I'll hand back to Joe. If there are any questions, pop them in the chat, but hand back to Joe and for the 10th for the career resilience.
Yes. So does anybody have any questions for Brin? And thank you, Brin, for not just sharing your story, because I think that allowed all of us to feel like we could also share our stories as well. And it's okay to feel vulnerable because this is a safe space with a lot of love and support. So thank you for creating that space for us today, and lots of celebratory claps there for you. Anybody have any questions for Brin or want to share anything? Stick your hand up if you do. If not, mindful we've only got a couple of minutes. So you know, it's really important at a time when everybody's facing so much, I think, uncertainty and transactional change. It's often easy to feel that you as a person and your story and your value and your worth can get lost in that. And so this is about helping you to reclaim that for yourself, that you own your own story and that you can write the story that you want to be heard. And part of that, as I said, we'll follow up in the session next week if people are interested in how do you turn that ability to curate your own story about what's meaningful to you into things that are going to be practical in terms of job role, and if you're applying for your own job internally, or even if you're just thinking about career direction, or you just want to brush up because it's been a little while. We're going to do some very practical things next week in terms of how do you face that sort of daunting process of having to either, write your own story about how good you are in your job or how good you are for other employers, and what kind of tools and techniques we can bring to help you through that process. So there will be a email afterwards that gives links to the recording and plus the resources that go with it. Do fill in the feedback form. It's always really helpful to us. And as you said, I think this is incredibly powerful. And if we can do something like this, if you let us know what you want that to look like, we can set it up and make it happen. And thank you all for sharing your stories as well, and being open and courageous, because I think it is. And I want you to celebrate yourselves for being courageous today. So hopefully, despite the wet and gloomy weather, everybody's feeling a little bit more positive about themselves and about being welcomed and being part of a community and feeling valued. So thank you all for being here today, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you again next week. But do sign up for the other events as well, and keep the community supporting each other and going. Okay, everybody, have a great rest of the day. Take care of yourselves.